Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Speak and Feel English podcast, the place where we help you understand English in a simple, natural, and confident way. I'm Mia, and today I'm joined by Ethan, as always. In today's episode, we are going to explore a very interesting and useful topic in English grammar and conversation, which is how to use the expressions could have and could have been. These two structures are extremely common in everyday conversations, storytelling, and even professional discussions. However, many learners often feel confused about when to use them and how their meanings change depending on the situation.
Thank you, Mia. I am really excited about today's discussion because could have and could have been are powerful expressions that help us talk about possibilities in the past. They allow us to reflect on situations that did not happen but were possible, or situations that might have happened under different circumstances. These phrases are extremely useful when you want to analyze past decisions, imagine alternative outcomes, or simply describe something that had the potential to happen but did not.
Exactly, Ethan. When people start learning English, they often understand the basic modal verb could, which is usually used to express ability or possibility. However, when we combine could with have, the meaning changes slightly, because now we are referring to something related to the past. In simple terms, could have is used to talk about something that was possible in the past, but did not actually happen.
That is a very clear explanation, Mia. Let us consider a practical example so our listeners can understand it more easily. Imagine that a student had the opportunity to apply for a scholarship, but did not apply. In that case, we could say, you could have applied for that scholarship. In this sentence, we are saying that the opportunity existed in the past, but the person did not take it.
Yes, and what makes this structure interesting is that it can express several subtle meanings depending on the context. Sometimes could have expresses regret. For example, someone might say, I could have studied harder for the exam. This sentence suggests that the speaker now realizes that studying more would have been possible and perhaps beneficial, but they did not do it at the time.
That is an excellent point. It is also important to note that could have is often used when discussing missed opportunities. Suppose someone arrived at the airport late and missed their flight. They might say, I could have caught the flight if I had left home earlier. Here, the speaker is describing a situation where a different action in the past might have produced a different outcome.
Another interesting use of could have is when we talk about possibilities or guesses about the past. For example, imagine that your friend did not answer their phone. Later, you might say, she could have been busy. In this case, you're making a possible explanation for something that happened earlier.
That example also introduces another structure that we will discuss today, which is could have been. This expression is slightly different because it usually refers to the state or condition of something in the past. When we say could have been, we are often describing a possibility about what someone or something might have been like in the past.
Exactly. Let me give another example so our listeners can clearly see the difference. Imagine you watch a movie and you think the actor was extremely talented. You might say, he could have been a great theater performer. This sentence suggests that the person had the potential to become something impressive, even if that path was never taken.
Right, and in everyday conversations, these expressions appear frequently when people reflect on decisions. For instance, someone might say, that project could have been very successful if the team had communicated better. Here, we are analyzing a past situation and suggesting that a different approach in the past might have produced a better result.
What I really like about these expressions is that they allow speakers to think about alternative realities. Language becomes a way to imagine different outcomes. We can reflect on what might have happened, what should have happened, or what could have happened if circumstances were different.
That is very true. In fact, these structures are very common in storytelling. When people talk about important life decisions, they often use sentences such as, I could have moved to another city, or I could have started that business earlier. These sentences show that the speaker recognizes a possibility that existed in the past.
And sometimes these expressions are not about regret at all. They can simply describe potential situations. For example, if you hear a loud noise at night, you might say, that could have been the wind. In this case, you're not expressing regret. You're simply suggesting a possible explanation.
Exactly. So, in summary, could have generally refers to a possible action in the past that did not happen, while could have been usually refers to a state, identity, or condition in the past. Understanding this difference helps learners use these expressions more naturally.
Now, we introduced the basic idea behind the expressions could have and could have been, and we explained that these structures help us talk about possibilities in the past. Now, I think it would be helpful to explore more practical examples so our listeners can clearly understand how these expressions are used in everyday conversations.
That is a great idea, Ethan. One of the easiest ways to understand could have is to think of it as a way of describing a past opportunity or a past possibility that did not happen. For instance, imagine a situation where a person had the chance to attend a professional conference that might have helped their career, but they decided not to go. Later, they might say, I could have attended that conference, but I decided to stay home and finish my work. This sentence clearly shows that the opportunity existed, but the person did not take it.
Exactly, and this type of sentence appears very often when people reflect on decisions. Another example might be related to education. Suppose someone had the opportunity to study a different subject in college. Years later, they might say, I could have studied architecture, but I chose business instead. In this case, the speaker is simply explaining that there was another possible path they could have taken in the past.
Yes, and sometimes these sentences contain a feeling of reflection rather than regret. When people talk about their past experiences, they naturally think about alternative possibilities. That is why expressions like could have are extremely common when people discuss life choices, career decisions, or even small daily situations.
Let us also discuss how could have can appear in situations where someone is offering criticism or pointing out a better option that existed earlier. For example, imagine that someone prepared a presentation for a meeting but forgot to include important data. A colleague might say, you could have added more statistics to support your argument. This sentence suggests that adding those statistics was possible, and it would have improved the presentation.
That is a very good example because it shows how this structure can be used in constructive feedback. In professional environments, people often use phrases like this to reflect on improvements that could have been made. For instance, a manager might say, we could have planned the project timeline more carefully. This does not necessarily mean that the project failed, but it highlights a possibility for improvement.
Now, let us turn our attention to could have been, which introduces a slightly different idea. As we mentioned earlier, could have been usually refers to a possible state, role, or condition in the past. Instead of focusing on an action that did not happen, it focuses on what someone or something might have become or might have been like.
Exactly. Imagine a talented musician who decided to pursue a different career path. Someone might say, she could have been an incredible concert pianist. In this case, the sentence suggests that the person had the talent and potential to become something remarkable, even though that path was never pursued.
Another example could come from sports. Suppose a young athlete showed great potential during school years but eventually chose a different profession. A friend might say, he could have been a professional athlete. This sentence expresses the idea that the person had the ability or opportunity to reach that level, even though it never happened.
That is a very common pattern in conversations about talent and potential. People often reflect on what someone might have achieved under different circumstances. Sometimes it is about missed opportunities, and sometimes it is simply about recognizing someone's abilities.
It is also important to understand that could have been can be used when we are making guesses about past situations. For example, if you see an empty parking space where a car used to be, you might say, someone could have been parked here earlier. This sentence simply suggests a possible explanation for what you are observing.
Yes, and another example might occur when people try to explain an unexpected event. Imagine that you hear a loud sound outside your house late at night. The next morning, you might say, that noise could have been a delivery truck. In this case, you are not certain about what happened, but you are offering a possible explanation.
What I find interesting is that both expressions allow speakers to think about possibilities in the past, but they focus on different aspects of those possibilities. Could have usually focuses on actions that were possible but did not occur, while could have been focuses more on states, identities, or explanations.
Exactly. And understanding that difference helps learners use these expressions naturally. When you are talking about something a person might have done, could have is usually the correct choice. When you are talking about what someone or something might have been, then could have been becomes the better option.
Another useful tip for learners is to listen carefully to how these expressions appear in natural conversations, movies, interviews, and discussions. The more you hear them in context, the easier it becomes to understand the subtle meanings they carry.
And practicing with real-life examples can also make a big difference. When you reflect on your own experiences, you can easily create sentences such as, I could have learned another language, or that situation could have been avoided. These simple exercises help you become more comfortable using these expressions in daily communication.
I think this is the perfect moment to explore how could have and could have been appear in more detailed discussions, especially when people analyze past situations. These expressions are not only used in casual conversations, but also appear frequently in professional environments, storytelling, and thoughtful reflections about decisions and outcomes.
That is absolutely right. When people look back at events and try to understand what went right or what might have gone differently, they naturally use these expressions. For example, imagine a team that worked on an important project but did not achieve the expected results. During a meeting afterward, one of the team members might say, "We could have communicated more clearly during the planning phase." In this sentence, the speaker is pointing out a possible action that might have improved the outcome.
Yes, and that example highlights how these structures are often used in evaluation or analysis. Instead of simply criticizing a situation, speakers use could have to express what might have improved things. It allows people to reflect constructively rather than simply focusing on mistakes.
Exactly. Another example might come from a personal situation. Imagine someone who planned a vacation but encountered several unexpected problems during the trip. After returning home, they might say, "We could have checked the weather forecast more carefully before leaving." In this sentence, the speaker realizes that a simple action in the past might have prevented certain difficulties.
That is a very relatable example because situations like that happen to many people. When individuals look back at their experiences, they often recognize small decisions that might have changed the outcome. Using could have helps them express that reflection in a clear and natural way.
Now let us shift our attention to could have been, which often appears in slightly different contexts. While could have focuses on actions, could have been often focuses on conditions, identities, or possibilities related to what something might have become. For example, imagine a historic building that was not preserved properly and eventually disappeared. Someone might say, that building could have been an important cultural landmark. This sentence suggests that the building had the potential to become something valuable for the community.
That example demonstrates how could have been is often used when discussing potential or unrealized possibilities. It highlights what something might have represented if circumstances had been different. Another example might involve creative projects. Suppose a filmmaker had an interesting concept for a movie but did not complete the project. Someone might say, that film could have been a remarkable story. In this case, the speaker is recognizing the potential value of something that was never fully realized.
Yes, and we also hear this structure when people talk about historical events or turning points in history. For instance, historians sometimes analyze major decisions and say things like, that agreement could have been a turning point in international relations. The sentence suggests that the event had the potential to create a major change.
Another interesting use of could have been appears when people are uncertain about the past and they're trying to guess what happened. For example, imagine that someone finds a set of old photographs in an attic. They might say, these pictures could have been taken many decades ago. In this case, the speaker is making a reasonable guess about the past.
That type of usage is very common in everyday conversations. When people do not have complete information about a past event, they often use could have been to suggest possible explanations. For example, if someone hears about a sudden change in a company's leadership, they might say, there could have been internal disagreements. This sentence does not claim certainty, it simply suggests a possible reason.
Exactly, and that highlights an important feature of these expressions. They allow speakers to talk about possibilities without sounding too certain or too direct. This can be particularly useful in professional discussions where people want to analyze situations carefully and respectfully.
Another point worth mentioning is that tone and context can change the feeling behind these sentences. Sometimes could have expresses regret, while other times it simply describes an alternative possibility. For example, when someone says, I could have visited you last weekend, the meaning depends on the situation. It might express regret, or it might simply explain that the opportunity existed, but other plans were chosen.
That is an excellent observation. Context always plays an important role in understanding the true meaning of these expressions. When learners listen carefully to the surrounding conversation, they can usually identify whether the speaker is expressing regret, possibility, analysis, or speculation.
And as learners become more comfortable with these structures, they begin to use them naturally when discussing experiences, decisions, and possibilities. These expressions add depth to conversations because they allow speakers to reflect on the past in thoughtful and meaningful ways. Now, let's talk about some common mistakes learners often make when using the expressions could have and could have been. Even though the idea behind these structures is not extremely complicated, many learners struggle with them because they involve past possibilities and specific verb forms.
That is very true. One of the most common mistakes involves the verb form that follows could have. In correct English grammar, could have must always be followed by the past participle form of a verb. However, learners sometimes mistakenly use the base form of the verb instead. For example, someone might say, I could have go to the meeting. The correct sentence should be, I could have gone to the meeting.
Exactly. The structure is always could have plus a past participle verb, such as done, gone, seen, made, or completed. Once learners remember this pattern, it becomes much easier to construct correct sentences. For instance, she could have finished the report earlier, or they could have solved the problem more quickly.
Another mistake occurs when learners confuse could have with could. These two forms have different meanings. The word could on its own often describes ability or possibility in general, while could have specifically refers to something that was possible in the past but did not happen. For example, if someone says, I could swim when I was younger, they are describing past ability. But if they say, I could have swum in the competition, they are referring to a past opportunity that was not taken.
That distinction is very important because it changes the entire meaning of the sentence. Without the word have, the statement describes ability or possibility in general. With have, it becomes a reflection on a past situation that did not actually occur.
Let us also discuss mistakes related to could have been. Just like could have, this expression also requires a specific grammatical pattern. After could have been, we usually add an adjective, a noun, or a description of a condition. For example, that solution could have been effective, or she could have been an excellent teacher.
Yes, and learners sometimes forget the word been when they try to describe a past condition. For instance, someone might say, he could have a great leader, which is incorrect. The correct sentence is, he could have been a great leader. The word been connects the modal structure with a description of the person or situation.
Another interesting mistake happens when learners use these expressions in situations where certainty is required. Remember that could have and could have been usually express possibility, not certainty. If you are completely sure about something in the past, you would normally use a different structure.
That is a very good point. For example, if someone says, "She could have been the manager last year," it suggests that the speaker is not entirely certain about the situation. However, if the speaker knows the fact clearly, they would say, "She was the manager last year."
Exactly. Understanding this difference helps learners choose the right expression, depending on whether they are describing a possibility, a missed opportunity, or a confirmed fact.
Another useful strategy for mastering these expressions is consistent practice. Learners can create sentences about everyday situations, such as work, travel, education, or personal experiences. For example, someone might say, "I could have prepared for that meeting more thoroughly," or "That idea could have been very successful if we had implemented it earlier."
Practicing with real situations makes the expressions feel more natural. Over time, learners begin to recognize these patterns automatically when they listen to conversations, read articles, or watch interviews. Eventually, using them becomes effortless. As we reach the final part of today's discussion, let us take a moment to summarize the most important ideas we explored in this episode. Throughout our conversation, we focused on understanding how the expressions could have and could have been help speakers describe possibilities related to the past.
That is right. We began by explaining that could have is generally used to describe an action that was possible in the past, but did not actually happen. It often appears when people talk about missed opportunities, alternative decisions, or actions that might have produced a different outcome.
For example, someone might say, "I could have started that project earlier," which suggests that beginning earlier was possible but did not occur. This structure allows speakers to reflect on their past decisions in a thoughtful way.
Then we explore the expression could have been, which focuses more on states, identities, or conditions in the past. Instead of describing an action that did not happen, it often describes what someone or something might have become.
A simple example would be, "She could have been an outstanding scientist." This sentence highlights potential and talent, suggesting that under different circumstances, the person might have reached that role.
We also discussed how both expressions can be used when people analyze situations or attempt to explain past events. When someone is uncertain about what happened, they might say something like, "That delay could have been caused by technical issues." This shows that the speaker is offering a possible explanation rather than stating a confirmed fact.
Another important idea we mentioned was the grammatical structure. After could have, the verb must always appear in its past participle form, such as done, seen, finished, or created. This rule helps ensure that the sentence clearly refers to a past situation.
And after could have been, we usually add a description, a role, or a condition. For example, "The plan could have been more effective," or "He could have been a remarkable leader."
What makes these expressions particularly valuable is that they allow speakers to think about possibilities and alternatives. Language becomes a tool for reflection, imagination, and analysis.
Exactly. When learners become comfortable with these structures, their conversations gain depth and clarity. They can explain past situations more precisely and discuss potential outcomes in a thoughtful and engaging way.
A helpful practice technique is to review your own experiences and create sentences using these expressions. For instance, you might say, "I could have learned another skill last year," or "That idea could have been a great opportunity." Practicing in this way helps you internalize the structure.
Over time, these expressions will begin to feel natural in conversations, presentations, and storytelling. The more you listen to authentic English and practice using it yourself, the more confident you will become.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us and being part of today's discussion.
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to continue improving your English through conversations like this, make sure you subscribe and stay connected for more episodes.
For more helpful discussions and learning content, remember to follow the Speak and Feel English podcast and keep practicing your English every day.